Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we are going through a workshop on podcasting. This is the first of two workshops that we're going to be running. This one is focused on analytics. I am Elizabeth Dubois. I'm an associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Communication, and I'm a university research chair in politics, communication, and technology. I've got two really wonderful guests with me today, Michael Geist, who is also a professor at U Ottawa in law and the host of the Law Bites podcast, and Vinita Srivastava, who is the host of Don't Call Me Resilient at The Conversation Canada. And then myself, I host the Wonks and War Rooms podcast. One thing these podcasts all have in common is that we try and translate academic information to other public audiences. And those audiences are different for each of us, but the general idea of using audio formats to get academic knowledge out is the key similarity here. So our plan for today, we are going to be chatting through how we use and sometimes don't use podcast analytics in our own work. We're going to start off. I'll give you some preliminary information. Then I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Hennessy, who's been a research assistant on the Wonks and War Rooms podcast since it began. And she's going to go over some key metrics. We'll have a bit of a chat, myself, Vinita, and Michael. Then we'll talk about some additional metrics that you might have heard of before and you might be wondering about. There'll be a few closing notes, and then we're going to open it up to question and answers from all of you. So the Q&A chat option is available at any point. If at any point you have a question, throw it in the chat. We're happy to kind of collate them. We will be saving most of those Q&As until that Q&A period at the end. So if we don't answer it right away, it's not that we're ignoring you or we've forgotten, but just that we're going to kind of batch them all near to the second half of this workshop. So let's get started. We need to think about why we bother tracking metrics, the ways that the technology behind podcasts actually work. And so here we're going to talk about podcast syndication. We're going to talk about how you actually find the metrics and the analytics that you might want to use in your various dashboards. And we're going to talk about a concept called benchmarking. So let's get started. Why track metrics? Well, metrics can be really helpful for you to understand your audience. Without them, you don't really have a great way of getting a sense of who is paying attention to you, what they're liking, what they're not liking. They can help you measure your reach and identify the content your listeners actually want to see more of. There's a lot of value in terms of the ability of these metrics to summarize a whole lot of data very simply, very quickly for you, so you have a quick snapshot of how your podcast is doing. That said, they can also be kind of difficult to understand. It can be hard to know which metrics matter, and it can be difficult to continually pay attention to all these metrics when you're also trying to, get episodes out each week or every 2 weeks, whatever it is your schedule. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about which metrics we find most useful and why. So next up, let's talk about podcast syndication. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that there are two kind of main websites, platforms, bits of technology that are really important for getting a podcast out, and each of them offer analytics in different ways. So there are the hosts. For me, Buzzsprout is the host, but there's a variety of others. These are the places where you store your episodes, and they are often also tools that you can use to connect with what are called distributors. The distributors are the ones who syndicate the podcast, who get it out to wider audiences of listeners. So this might be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, etc. These tools all embed a bunch of different kinds of metrics within them. One example we have here is from the Law Bites podcast, and this is something that Michael shared earlier before the session with me. And you can see here in this graphic, what we've got is a visualization of the number of listens that this particular episode got from different kinds of sources. And so here in pink, we've highlighted 2 distributors, and then in blue, we've got the various browsers where people have gotten the data from. Now, how do we find the different metrics and analytics we're going to be talking about today? Well, there are options for aggregated data. Here, it's usually from your podcasting host. So again, for me, that's Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout, when I log in, has a dashboard and I can navigate through it to find most of the different kinds of data that they've pulled in from different sources. So they aggregate together total number of listens, total number of downloads from all of the different sources on the internet that somebody might have gone to listen to an episode of the podcast. Then there are platform-specific data sources. And so this is where you can go in and find downloads from Spotify, for example, or listens from Apple Podcasts as another example. And these can help you drill down into more detail into how particular distributors are being used for your podcast, but they are very particular to that specific one, and often look very different one to the next. And so it can be a little bit challenging to match up what analytics you're finding from Spotify versus Podcast Addict versus Apple as examples there. And finally, there are these third-party analytics services, and there are some free options like Podbean and a bunch of different paid options. In the handout that we're going to provide you at the end of all of this, we've got links to a bunch of those, so you'll be able to kind of go through and see what options are there. Lastly, I want to talk about the idea of benchmarking. So benchmarking is essentially when you pick some threshold for a given analytic and say, this is what I think of as success or as my bare minimum. And I'm going to measure my success against that benchmark that I've set. It could be I'm trying to measure this season in relation to last season. It could be I'm going to measure my podcast in relation to Michael's podcast, or some other way of doing it. You decide what your benchmarks are. But what's useful about benchmarks is it gives you some sort of bar that you are reaching towards. And so you can have a better sense of what the goals actually are. There's also a ton of resources out there about how to do good benchmarking. We're not going to get into it in this episode or this workshop rather, but in the handout, we've got a bunch of links for resources on how to set realistic benchmarks that matter for the kind of audiences and reach you're aiming for. All right, so at this point, we are going to move over to our key metrics. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to talk about downloads, playthrough rate, and top episodes.
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth. So my name is Michelle. I'm a lab member in the Paul Comtech lab here at the University of Ottawa. And I'm also a student member of the Faculty of Law. So I'm going to take you through a few different things. First of all, we'll look at downloads, or some people call these listens. So downloads are the number of times that a listener hits the download icon on your episode or hits play on an app or on a browser. And these are important because they allow you to quantify your reach. Right. So not only do they tell you if people are actually interested in listening to what you have to say, but they tell you how many people are interested. You can access these numbers in aggregate on your hosting platform. Third-party analytics also provide these, and so do distribution platforms. But when you're looking at them, I would suggest considering them in a few different ways. So first, you can look at the number of downloads you have per episode, and then divide that also by number of downloads per episode for all time versus for that week or versus for that month. But you can also look at the average number of downloads. So average number of downloads per episode, but also per season or per year. And this information can help you figure out if your audience is growing or if it's maybe plateauing or stagnating. You can also consider here downloads or listens by time of day or by day of week. And this can be really helpful if you're trying to figure out, what's the best day of the week for me to be releasing my episodes? Are people tired by Friday and not really into hearing another podcast? Or is Friday like the best day for my listeners because it's going into the weekend? All right, so this visualization, it's just an example of what this information looks like for the Wonks and Warrooms podcast on our podcast host, which is Buzzsprout. And so here you can see really obvious peaks and valleys with the different seasons, and specifically the valley in the summer. So this is really cool and can be a really good visualization and comparative visualization for season over season. So really useful for internal benchmarking. Buzzsprout also provides data on the number of episode downloads within the first 7 days of a podcast release per episode. And this can be a good indication of whether your topics or your titles or your guests are immediately resonating with your audience as you release those episodes. And while I don't know, take this benchmark with a grain of salt, but one external benchmark that we did find in our research indicates that if you're getting over 125, 124 downloads in the first 30 days of your podcast release, then you're in the top 50% of podcasts. All right, but there's a lot of things that this isn't going to tell you, right? Downloads are limited in how much information they provide about your listeners engaging with your show. So I also want to talk about playthrough rates. You can also hear these called consumption rates or listen rates, and they're usually percentages indicating how far through an episode your listeners stayed tuned in for, listened to you. And this is important because it tells you if listeners are actually listening to the episode to the end, not just clicking download and then maybe, not listening to it or dropping out after the first 5 minutes. So this can be really helpful for inferring your listeners' preferred episode length. So are your episodes too long or too short, and can indicate technical issues. So if there's a sudden drop off halfway through your episode, and that's really uncommon, that might be dead air. This type of metric, though, isn't supported by everybody, but Apple, Spotify, Google, Podbean, and those ones all support this. So here's an example of Wonks and Warrooms on Spotify. This is data from Spotify. So Spotify calls starts, they use the term starts for what we call here a download or a listen. So anytime somebody starts listening to your episode, whereas they call streams the number of times a listener has listened for over 60 seconds. So they're trying to provide you a little bit more detail on what your dropout rate is like. And similar data is available from other distributors, but like Elizabeth said, it kind of varies from distributor to distributor. For example, Apple calls users who listen to at least 20 minutes or 40% of your episode, those are termed engaged listeners. So different terminology like that. These distributors will also provide you information on how long through the episode itself individually listeners stayed. So here you can see one of our top episodes. There's a bit of an initial drop off at the beginning, which is quite normal. Guests are trying to figure out, is this a topic I'm interested in? Is this a guest I care about? And then there's pretty consistent engagement throughout the rest of the episode, which is great. If you do notice, though, that you get a lot of drop off partway through your episode, maybe consider playing with the episode length, or consider transitions or music or something to break that up to avoid fatigue. And then this is the last sort of key metric we're going to look at. It's just what your top episodes are. So which episodes have the most listens? And this is great for if you're trying to plan future content. Maybe think about what topics resonated with your guests, with your listeners. A note here, though, top episodes are not necessarily the ones that people like the most, right? They can be the most controversial episodes, or they could be the shortest episodes. So the shorter the episode is, the more likely it is that it's going to be in the top, specifically if it's a trailer. So take that into consideration. All right, so this is what this looks like for Wonks and Warrooms. We see our episodes, that the title of the episodes and the number of downloads in sort of a descending order. And then this can be narrowed to look at it by season or by year or time. So with sort of that more technical background, I want to pass it now back to our guests to talk about how these stats actually work in their life. Like, do you actually use these? Are they helpful? Do you pay attention to them? Do you know that they're there but not use them? So we do actually have time for 10 minutes. We can discuss this. Yeah, so maybe we'll start with Vinita. Do you maybe want to talk about, do you set benchmarking goals or do you look at these metrics?
Well, so when we first started, it was really kind of a situation of just closing our eyes, me closing my eyes, and after making sure everything was right with our episode and hitting publish, just not really wanting to look. It's one of those like very scary things to look at. But as a journalist working in a news organization that's responsible to, my sponsors, my funders, SSHRC, who's also one of my funders, to think about those things, I really did have to look at metrics for that reason. And also as we continue to grow, to look for more sponsors, et cetera, we really need to know who our audience is and what's happening. So at first, for sure not, I didn't want to know what was happening. And then once I got into it, then I got too obsessed with it. It's like refresh, who's listening, what's going on. And now, in fact, we're heading into season 5 next week as we do this. And we have a real idea of, based on the 4 seasons, of what people do like and what people really love the most out of our, I don't know, approximately 30, I don't know how many episodes we have, and 6 times 4, I guess it's 24 episodes. So 24 episodes, which ones really perform the best. But as you just said, that is also, it's not necessarily giving me a full picture of what's most important. So for me, benchmarks, yes, I do set them. I want to know that one episode is doing well within 7 days, and then within 2 weeks, then within 3 weeks. So I do check to see that. We have a certain benchmark, which is I need to see a certain number of listens within 7 days. And if we don't get that, then I know that episode is either not, just didn't really resonate with our particular audience, or it's going to wait for what happens with us too, is sometimes we actually double in numbers. So we have a number that comes down in 1 week, and then within a month or 2 months, that number sometimes triples. So we do have this kind of long listening tail. I find that people circulate our episodes, it takes some time. But it's that first 7 days that I'm looking for. The biggest thing that I can say is that season 5 is really a response to some of our most popular episodes. So some of our most popular episodes were those episodes that really looked at the most current news event that was happening. It was a critical race perspective on current news events. Our other episodes were longer, more deeper dives into topics. And so we've decided to take a more newsier approach with season 5, partly because of our metrics. So yes, of course, I do look at metrics. As somebody who is a journalist in the critical race space, however, it is something that I do really take into consideration when we think about, we always talk about this in journalism, and you guys, of course, we talk about the clickbaits, et cetera, et cetera. We want to make sure that we're covering what's really important and important to us as producers and journalists, not always what's going to get the most listens. So sometimes it's a fine balance that we have to really work on.
Thank you. That was great to hear. I loved to hear how you put those top episodes into practice, like in terms of coming out with season 5, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what about, so for Michael Geist, I know for his podcast, and Vinita, I'm not sure about Don't Call Me Resilient, but Mike, Law Bites has sort of different types of episodes. So I think they have like guest episodes, but then they also have more like clip or response type episodes. I'm wondering from all of you, do you think that this is important to consider when you're taking into account metrics, or do you notice a difference or a pattern in your metrics when you use these different types of episodes?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. And just first off, thanks for the invitation. I must admit, I don't look at my metrics very often at all. I probably did. I'm a little bit of the reverse. I probably did a lot at the beginning, just because you want to see, hey, is anybody listening to this? And how much was I able to take my existing sort of social media audience and blogging audience and stuff like that, and then transition them over to a podcast or get them to listen to that. Honestly, now I don't really listen that much. I do get a Chartable email that popped up in your presentation a little bit earlier. So I get one of those every day, and there are many episodes that kind of will at the beginning of the week enter into the top 200 podcasts in Canada. for Apple in tech, sometimes in other countries or other categories. And sometimes I'm keen to see how it goes. And in the first couple of days, sometimes it's gone as high as the top 10. So it does pretty well. It can do pretty well, and then it will tail off very quickly. And as your graph illustrated, when I'm not producing episodes, then the numbers are lower, of course. I don't have seasons. I dropped my 160th episode this morning, so I just kind of keep going. And when I decide I want to take a break, I take a break. And that's, I must admit, a little bit my attitude generally. It's my podcast. I'm hoping to educate people, to get people engaged. I long ago came to the realization or the view that, to make my research relevant and the advocacy I do relevant, I couldn't require people to read my blog or academic articles or a book. I needed to sort of reach them where in whatever different ways they like to get information. And it became pretty clear over time that a podcast was something that was a useful way to try to do that as well. And so now it has a pretty good audience. I often, frankly, just use basic feedback. We can get into this later. I just use basic feedback, the emails and the kind of traction it gets on social media to get a general sense of how well it's doing. So that's a little more anecdotal. The one thing I would mention, and it's consistent with what Vinita had to say, is that there is a really notable long tail, at least certainly in my experience. So I did happen to look towards the end of last year, and I noted that every single one of my podcasts, it was about 145 episodes, I suppose, at that time, had been listened to. I think it was at least 500 times over the course of the prior year, and some of them were older, right? So for me, I thought that was quite decent. That means practically speaking, just about every episode gets listened to every day by someone. And I know sometimes they get incorporated into courses and classes, or people are just conducting searches and they find it useful. And so part of it is there's of course that burst each time you do it, but I kind of look at it as a bit more of a long game with a view that you're putting this out and it has value that exceeds well beyond that initial what's the latest episode kind of thing.
I actually love that. That's one of the most gratifying things for me, is to hear those anecdotal stories from especially teachers, like teachers of middle school, teachers of undergrad, that they're assigning. And I think that's the reason why the numbers go up after several months, is all of a sudden you get a class of, 100 undergrads listening. Or I got a great email from a grade 7-8 teacher the other day who said he's assigning certain episodes. And that's really great to hear that people from such a great age range are listening.
Yeah, I agree. As you were each talking about that, I was also reflecting on how Wonks and War Rooms gets embedded. I created it for my teaching in the first place, so I embedded it in a lot of my classes, but then other people have been embedding it in their teaching too. And it makes me wonder if this is like unique to our experiences because we're creating podcast episodes that are more evergreen, more likely to be continually interesting over time. Whereas a news podcast, for example, has more of a distinct shelf life, I would say.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about, because that's what we're going into, this very distinct, shelf life that we're now moving into. Of course, we're still going to do evergreens, and probably, as you know, things are the news cycle is just like a little peg that you can attach the story to that is actually an evergreen story. Their stories are always cycling around. If we talk about, for example, police brutality against Black folks in Canada, well, that story is going to keep coming up. So it might be a news story, but it's something that'll keep coming up. You asked about different types of episodes and, different sort of formats. We don't really have different formats. It's all pretty much a standard, interview host, guest interview situation. But we do have these moments with ourselves as a small production team where we feel sometimes that we are covering things that are very heavy and really, really challenging topics. And so in our small meetings, we call them, moments of joy or joy breaks, where we really need to talk about something that uplifts us. And so we'll do an episode that it's more for for us, we need a break, and we find that those episodes do well with the audience as well. So we did an episode on, comedy and racism, and put a lot of comedy in that episode, a lot of clips, and that really helped us. And I feel like our audience really responded as well to that.
Yeah. Sorry, just quickly to pick up on that thing. It's interesting to see that kind of transition. I, as you mentioned, I do have several different types of episodes. Mainly, it's the conversational type of ones. And the issue once I've gotten to this number is how many times can you bring back a guest, or when can you bring back a guest? So I've started. Sometimes I've had a few people who've appeared twice, but part of my goal initially was to give platforms to a lot of people who weren't typically heard from, or out in the public space. And so it was, I think, really useful to try to use, and I continue to view that as a key goal. But the clip episodes, which are sometimes a collection of clips that say it would take a listener into a committee debate around a piece of legislation so they could hear what the MPs are actually saying, or sometimes what I said if I appeared before committee. They do get good response, I have to say, because people don't typically listen to those kinds of things or follow committees. And to actually hear what's taking place in the committees sometimes can be a bit eye-opening. It often can be quite discouraging, just to actually kind of see the sausage made, so to speak. But those have been some pretty popular episodes. And I also just, as a side, I started doing towards the end of last year, I kind of just would do a year-end wrap episode where it was just me talking for 25, 30 minutes kind of thing. And I was like, does anybody really want this? And I have to say that got a significant more feedback than I usually get from people saying it's exactly the kind of thing that they wanted, that they thought it kind of brought together a lot of issues in a condensed period of time. So it's people presumably not listening to every episode, but found it a really useful thing. And so undertook to this year to try to incorporate that on occasion. Because apparently people are happy to get that kind of variation, I suppose. Sometimes the conversation, sometimes things a little different.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, Michael. I did a funded season, SSHRC. There was a SSHRC Connection grant that funded a season on critical digital media literacy and mis and disinformation. And I did a wrap up episode to pull things together. And I was like, nobody's going to want to listen to me just talk with nobody else there. But people liked it and thought it was helpful to pull things together. So yeah, shared experience.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? And we've talked about a lot of things. Maybe one of the things that we haven't discussed specifically would be playthrough rates. I don't know if anyone looks to.
I actually, so when I started this, I did a little bit of research, like what length of episode do people tend to actually listen to? I chatted with a bunch of students about what they thought ideal lengths were, and the responses I got were like 15 to 20 minutes or 60 minutes. And I'm like, well, 60 seems far too long. 15 to 20 is tight. But I decided to aim for like 20-ish minutes for my initial few episodes. And then when I was seeing my playthrough rates where people were actually listening to the very end, I was like, maybe I can push it a little further. And so now my episodes are about half an hour each, specifically because I was able to tell that people were in fact listening to the whole thing. And I had enough interest that I could extend it a little further.
I think for the sort of conversation, the interview type of pod, when you're really trying to get into an issue, it's really hard to do less than 24 minutes. I feel like it's getting really tight. I mean, you can do it, but it's really hard. It requires a little bit more editing time.
Yeah, I tend to go a bit longer than that, although I don't have a target. I got to admit either. I just sometimes they're a little shorter. Oftentimes they're a bit longer. Yeah. I do feel like I try to commit generally to be true to the guest, and so I edit for clarity. Sometimes you'll get a guest that has a lot of things like that, and you want them to sound good. Sometimes during the conversation there's stuff that they ask if could they rephrase or something like that, and so I'll edit for that. And so there's occasionally those sorts of things. But I typically feel I'm grateful for people taking the time. If you get a senator coming on and willing to spend time with you, I don't feel it's my place to start making significant changes because I've got an artificial number about how long this ought to be. And so I'm quite happy it can run long, and it's, I guess, consistent with my attitude that, you know, if someone doesn't want to listen anymore, that's okay. Oftentimes, I must admit, I guess personally, I mean, it's just me, I find some of the longer episodes some of the most interesting ones because it reflects the fact that it was a good conversation that we really got into. And if you are interested in this stuff, you're likely to stick around.
Yeah, I agree with those long conversations. It can be really nice. You can really get into it, and you can really hear what people are, you know, really trying to say. I like a longer podcast myself. 30 minutes is good for me if I'm going to listen to a conversation, but I understand people, you know, time is valuable and precious. So not just the people that we're interviewing, but our audience too.
Well, and the great, like, if you do have data on playthrough rates, right, it can be really helpful for proving to yourself, almost as in Elizabeth's case, right, that people actually are interested in a longer conversation is warranted. Okay. Thank you, all three of you. If it's okay with everybody, I'm going to go through quickly last 4 metrics that we can look at, and then turn it back to you 3 for discussion. And I think at 1 p.m. we'll move into more of a question and answer session. So looking at part 3. So what other metrics are we generally considering if we're looking at podcast analytics and podcast metrics? We're going to try and fly through these last 4 and then come back to discussion. So first of all, I'm going to talk about ratings, reviews, and subscribers, and I'm going to start with ratings and reviews. Ratings are scores out of 5 normally, and reviews are written feedback, written commentary, right, on your podcast. They can also be things that are maybe less traditionally understood as ratings and reviews, though, like a blogger that talks about your podcast, or someone on social media who does a call out, or being in a top 10 list, right, of new episodes or new podcasts. And this type of content is really important because it signals to potential users the quality that you provide and what you provide. Many listeners do really look to those ratings and reviews before choosing to listen to a new podcast. It's just like when we are trying to decide what restaurant to go to, we look on Google Maps, or we look at reviews on a food app, right? We're looking for reviews on podcasts too. So ratings and reviews can be beneficial for podcast hosts because they allow you to see, feedback from your audience members on what maybe they liked, what they didn't like, or what guests they really like. The problem here, though, is that these functions are really only supported by a handful of distribution platforms. So Apple has ratings and reviews. I believe Spotify does as well, but not all of them do. And there's a little bit of ambiguity here as to how much these ratings and reviews actually play into the distributors' algorithms and search recommendations. So we know with Apple, for example, they've committed to the fact that ratings and reviews will not influence how podcasts appear on their search and on their charts. Charts would just be based on play rate alone. But with other distributors, it's a little bit more opaque and a little bit more vague. If you want to explore how your ratings and reviews compare, it's a good sort of rule of thumb looking at the top 10 podcasts in Canada on various distributors. They all have over 4.0 for a rating out of 5. And the vast majority, I think when I looked, it was 9 out of 10 of them have 4.5 or over. So if you're interested in sort of having an external benchmark, there's one that you can turn to. Next, subscribers are, you may know this, they're the number of unique users who receive an update every time you publish an episode. And this is sometimes conceptualized as your audience base. However, I would caution you to proceed carefully with that. So more and more people are not subscribing to podcasts. They're just listening to them as they feel compelled to, or as they hear about the episodes. And also subscribers don't always listen to your podcast just because they subscribe. I'm really guilty of that. I subscribe to a number of podcasts and I don't listen to them as the episodes come out. So just be careful. It's useful, particularly if you have like a daily news show, right? We were talking about the differences between different types of shows. It can be really useful for those type of like daily activities. But say if you're doing a book review podcast, it's not quite as useful. If you want an external benchmark for this, there's you can see external, like public facing data from a few distributors. Castbox, Podcast Addict, and TuneIn provide like public data on how many subscribers people have, but usually you have to log into Spotify or Apple or whatever the distribution platform is. All right, So speaking of subscribers, I would also say, please don't discount the number of subscribers you have on your social media platform. So speaking to Michael's point earlier, the way that you publish and publicize your episodes on social media and other sort of web content can be really important, right? So micro content from social media platforms or other websites can help you tell if listeners are engaging with you outside of just listening to that episode. And it does raise some of those really important questions of how much are your personal followers translating into your listeners and vice versa, right? So to access data on content engagement, you do want to look at things like likes and comments and mentions and click-throughs. And a good tip here is, if you haven't already, switch your social media accounts to business accounts, because that will provide you more access to more data. You can use internal benchmarks. So, your year-over-year engagement versus, an external benchmark, like comparing your number of likes or comments to someone who has a similar podcast. Here, though, just be careful. There's a difference between likes and comments, right? And they both have value, but they are different things. A like takes a lot less effort than someone who's actually commenting, and someone who's liked your content may not have read it or listened to it, but someone who's commenting and actually talking about their response to that episode has likely listened to that episode. All right, third, audience demographics are another thing you can look at. They're the characteristics of your listeners, so things like sex or gender, geographic location, like we see in this picture here. So this is the dashboard for geographic location of the Law Bites listeners based on Law Bites hosting platform Castos, and it's an interactive map. So I believe you can click on the different parts of the world and they'll tell you more information about the people that are listening to Law Bites from that part of the world. This data is included on most hosting platforms, not just Castos. Buzzsprout has it as well. And they can be useful if you want to construct an idea or a profile of the type of listeners that you have. It's a little bit more personal than just a download count or a listen through count. You can use this information to tailor your website or configure your website into the screen size or resolution that's most beneficial to the devices your listeners are using, or you can sort of know where people are coming from, right? So you're listening to a podcast, say, about Canadian news, but you have a lot of people coming from Australia. It can be an interesting thing to look at. I would note, though, so here users can access your content from multiple devices and apps, and if they're running a VPN, their geographic data might not be accurate. And also that a lot of users may not realize that this data is being tracked. So here, it would also be important to take caution when you're making assumptions about your audience based on things like their age and location and gender. So this data is available, use it wisely and with a grain of salt. It's usually provided in aggregate by your host, and it can also be provided by distributors as well. This information can also be available on the last point I'd like to make, which is your number of page views on your website. So if you have a website for your podcast, I know Wonks and War Rooms has one, Law Bites has one. Both of those podcasts publish blog posts every time a new episode comes out. So you can look to the statistics on the blog post to infer or to find out information on page views and the demographics of your listeners. And depending on the demographics available, you may also have access to information like the length of time they stayed on your page, but also really importantly, the bounce rate. So a bounce rate is the number of times somebody has navigated to your page and then left the page right away. So imagine you go to a page and you click back right away. That is a bounce. And this is important because it can indicate that there might be a problem with the site, but also maybe they didn't find what they were looking for. Maybe it needed to be higher up on the page. And I'm just going to, there's a question in the chat about how gender is inferred from demographic, like audience demographic statistics. So this, I believe it would depend on the type of platform collecting the data. So if it's, say, Apple probably has some user inputted information or information that it has inferred from the types of content that user consumes, right? However, other platforms may not have that. It would depend. Some might not even have a gender option. I don't know if any of our guests can speak to that a little more, but I would say it would be something to go and look at for the different distribution platforms for sure. And take it with a grain of salt, right? Like this is not a holy grail. All right, so I've had enough talking. I'm good. I'd love to turn this discussion back over to our guests. We've got a lot of potential questions that we could ask here, like, is geographic location important to you? I know all three of you are podcasting from within Canada, but I'm guessing that your reach is probably more international. Is that important? Have you ever dealt with things like backfire in podcast reviews, or been part of top 10 lists and had to deal with feedback from that? I don't know, Elizabeth, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Let's start with the geography question. So, a lot of my stuff has been pretty Canada focused. There's, a couple of seasons where I've focused in on that SSHRC funded season, focusing in on digital literacy and mis and disinformation. And that season was more Canada focused, largely because SSHRC was the funder and it was about digital literacy within Canada among Canadians. And so, my target audience there was Canadians, but I also was absolutely delighted if anybody outside of Canada wanted to listen to it and continue to be. Some of the kinds of topics I talk about are more policy related, where maybe a national policy in Canada is very different from elsewhere. So an example here is we have an episode coming out this Wednesday, actually, about how tech companies are involved in political advertising campaigns and campaigns during elections. And my guest worked for the Biden campaign, worked in the States in a number of different ad agencies. And so she and I did a lot of back and forth. Because I know a lot of the audience of Wonks and War Rooms is Canadian, I did a lot more of kind of connecting the dots between the American system versus the Canadian system than I might otherwise would have, right? Like if I had a completely American base and they were talking about American politics, and like political advertising conversations often default to the American context anyway, I might have been less likely to really explain the Canada part.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I can jump in just to follow. So I get guests occasionally from, oftentimes actually from the U.S., Australia, from Europe, from different places, and so you often expect a little bit of a bump in listenership when that happens. A lot of the issues that I focus on are pretty global, and so you get responses that are more broad. I did one last week with Fenwick McKelvey from Concordia. We talked about the TikTok ban in Canada, which of course is Canadian focused, but resonates in other places, and got feedback from people elsewhere. Although when I envision the kind of the audience that I think about most, I often feel that this is a law and tech digital policy podcast that is trying to fill a bit of a gap in Canada. And that's not to say that there aren't some really good podcasts that talk about some of the stuff. Canada Land has an episode just this morning that focuses on stuff that I often talk about. Taylor Owens had a podcast that has often focused on some of these same kinds of things. So it's not that there's nobody out there doing it, but this one's probably the one that's most consistent on these issues. And so first and foremost, I'm thinking about Canada, but very often some of the best guests will be from around the world, and often you'll see a bit of a spike when someone from elsewhere does come on the podcast to talk.
Yeah, I feel the same way with Don't Call Me Resilient. I mean, our main mission, besides wanting to talk about the news with a critical race lens, is to also, elevate Canadian scholars on a global stage. But at the same time, we really do want to speak to a Canadian audience. We are trying to fill a gap in Canadian news media when it comes to coverage of issues through a critical race lens. And so we do aim for a Canadian audience. And that's not to say that we don't get an international audience, but our goal is really to get Canadians listening. We did an episode on, the slap that went around the world. Will Smith and Chris Rock, and that, besides being one of our top performing episodes, really went global. And it was wonderful because we had a Canadian scholar speaking to a global audience, and that's fantastic when that happens, but it's not necessarily our goal.
Thank you. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thanks. That's all super interesting. I also wanted to pick up on something that Michelle, you had said while you were going through those additional metrics, and you mentioned the idea of, if somebody on social media has commented on it, pretty good chance that they have actually listened to the episode. And I immediately was like, except for if they're trolls, except for if they're people who are like intentionally just trying to hate on you, right? And I've been lucky enough not to have a lot of that kind of feedback back, but I'm wondering, Michael, your podcast has been going on much longer than mine, and Vinita, you deal with critical race issues, which are often hot button, which often attract people who have a lot of not nice things to say. And so I'm wondering if either of you
I get a lot of you people,
and what
I
do you
get
do
a lot
when
of
you get
you
that?
people are despicable. You people
Yeah.
are despicable. I get that like almost every, day or week. You people are despicable, but I just delete those. Honestly, those are just, and they come in, the Don't Call Me Resilient is part of the Conversation Canada, and Conversation Canada has been publishing this kind of content since we launched 5 years ago. So we get, especially when it comes to text, people can read very quickly and they want to leave a comment that is sometimes borders or is actually hate. It's literally hate. And so, it's a crime to post that publicly. So we delete it immediately. So I'm speaking lightly of it because I've been pretty practiced with it for 5 years now. I just delete. I used to try and engage, and now I don't. And I'm really positive that a lot of those, not all, but a lot of those very low reviews on our podcast are also that kind of hate people who haven't necessarily even listened to us. They just don't like the idea of us. But that's part of what it is, I guess, to be out there in the public and to do this kind of work. I think that's what it is on the negative side. I just looked at one of those this morning. People get really angry, you really do. We always give a nice thanks. I think Elizabeth, you helped us with that letter. We always give a nice letter out to our guests. Other people in the Global Journalism Innovation Lab have helped with sending out a very nice, we have a nice letter that we send out to each one of our guests before we go live to alert them of the fact that they may be trolled and they may have a negative response on Twitter, especially, but just to give them some techniques about how to deal with it, and that we're also on standby to help them out if anything does happen. And that's happened once or twice. But we really try and surround our guests with positive comments and energy the week that stuff comes out, that our episode comes out. So nothing really terrible yet.
Thank you. I love the strategy with this and the previous one you talked about, like injecting joy and surrounding with positivity as much as you can, because that these are difficult topics that can really create a lot of hate, and being able to set yourself up for the least challenging route possible is important.
It's true. I think especially when we're talking about scholars who may have spent the last 2 years writing a book, and it's a different kind of an exercise. Obviously, you're more inside your own space, and then all of a sudden you're now promoting the book or you're talking about it in a public way, and to be thrust in this kind of space is very different. To lecture in one classroom versus now your lecture or your ideas are going kind of in a broader sense. It's very risky, I think, for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, did you want to hop in?
Sure, I can jump in. In some ways, the podcast becomes a little bit indistinguishable from some of the other stuff that I do, whether it's blogging or op-eds or Twitter and social media and things like that. And so I don't think there's been particular episodes that have been that have faced anything near what Vinita just described, which is terrible. I personally get targeted a fair amount for some of the views that I have. The parliamentary secretary of the Minister of Canadian Heritage, for example, over the summer suggested I was a racist because I was raising concerns around the government funding an anti-Semite and the lack of a response that came from from government ministers. He subsequently deleted that tweet and apologized, and then proceeded to call me a bully the next day in the media. So these kinds of things happen. As it happens, I actually then did a podcast with one of his colleagues, Anthony Housefather, Montreal area MP, talking about anti-Semitism and dealing with online hate as one of my episodes. So it was one way to try to counter some of that. Generally speaking, I try to just not feed the trolls and ignore. I mean, frankly, there are very few instances where engaging with someone who's just looking for attention and is trying to smear you in one way or another ends up good if what you're doing is trying to, I don't know, clarify or come back or debate. It every time it happens. Actually happened to me just last week where I did respond to something and it's like, I always wonder why I bother. And I often try to be reminded that typically the platforms that I've been able to grow are larger than those other people's platforms, and giving them more visibility and giving their arguments more visibility is perhaps part of their goal, and just isn't worth it. And so it can be hard sometimes, but just ignore. And there's a number of times I've just either block. I don't typically block people, but I do mute them. So just frankly, just don't see the discussion.
That's the optimist in you. I think I have that tendency too. Let me just try and have this conversation, and then it never really works out either. I mean, I think that's probably why we all got into this in the first place. You think that we want to have these conversations, and then I think there are times when you have to realize, as you're saying, you just have to shut those down. You just can't engage. Doesn't help. Takes us down the wrong rabbit hole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take this opportunity to do a little plug for a past episode of Wonks and War Rooms that I did. I chatted with CBC anchor Rosie Barton, Fatima Saeed, and Mark Blackburn, who all are journalists who all report on a lot of very challenging things and all get a lot of hate online. And we had a big discussion about how they manage all of that negativity and what they do and what works and what doesn't. And similar to what you've each said, kind of sticking to, this is an important story, so I'm going to tell it, and I'm just going to try and ignore or shut down or report when appropriate those folks and continue doing the job that I came here to do. All right, so I've got a few little closing notes I'm about to go through here for this kind of lecture portion of today's workshop, and then we're going to go into the Q&A period. We already have a few questions lined up, but I would love to have more. So if you're in the audience, you want to ask a question to the panel generally or anyone in particular, please go ahead and type those in. In the last couple minutes before we head into that section, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how you can make podcasting analytics work for you and why they might be important. We'll talk a little bit about grants, cross-promotion, and additional resources. So when we think about putting these analytics to work, one of the major things, and I believe both Michael and Vinita brought this up early on, is when you're thinking about your funders, when you're thinking about grant applications, when you're thinking about how you're going to convince other people that your podcast matters, using analytics can be really helpful. The big thing is you really need to contextualize that information in those applications, in those stories you're telling about how impactful your work is, because the benchmarks that you set for yourself are not going to be obvious to others. Your funders probably don't really know a ton about podcasting in the first place. And so you need to do the work of telling the story about what your analytics actually mean and how they relate to the other things out there in the ecosystem. And they help you really construct a narrative. You can use data from these various analytics to talk about your reach, your audience, why your audience might care about your work, what kinds of things they care most about, what types of formats are most exciting and interesting to them. One of the things that's worked in the Wonks and War Rooms example is by understanding who was making use of the podcast. In my case, it's a lot of students, a lot of people trying to get to know basic political communication theories and concepts off the bat, I was able to make an argument that I needed more funding for research assistants to help me create these annotated transcripts. And we're going to talk about those next week in the accessibility workshop. But I was able to use the analytics I already had to construct a story about why these annotated transcripts were going to be really, really useful to the audiences that I had. And then after I started using those transcripts, I was able to show just how frequently they're downloaded, how many people actually go and click through the different resources we annotate our transcripts with. And so it was a really helpful way of connecting the data to the narrative of what this podcast is trying to do, and then explain the value. And then the last thing I want to mention here is the idea of strategic cross-promotion. You can use different data from all of these different kinds of metrics to identify potential future guests, to identify collaborators, to figure out who might want to help you promote your episodes, and that sort of thing. One of the best kind of reaching episodes that we've had and that increased our subscriber rate was an episode where I had a guest who was the host of the Boys in Short Pants podcast, who is a political staffer. And so when Boys in Short Pants released one of our episodes in their stream, we were able to get out to a wider audience. And we could see, using the metrics, the success of that collaboration just by going back and looking at our numbers before and after the episode was released. So those are just a few examples. And what I'll do now is hand it back over to Vinita and Michael to see if either of you have examples from this grant application or strategic cost promotion angle here. And then once we do that, we'll go into the audience's questions.
To talk about strategic cross promotion just for a minute, because we're working on that right now, and I am doing a couple of co-productions with fellow podcasters in Canada who are working in the same space. They may be podcasters or journalists. They may not actually have their own show, but they're journalists producing content. And to be completely honest, this is a process that we're doing that has nothing to do with analytics at all. We actually are kind of putting the blinders on again when it comes to analytics, and making our partnerships, if you call it cross promotion, but they're more based on community and us trying to build a kind of a strong community of podcasters who are looking at the news, at issues in Canada with an angle or with the intent of doing it through an anti-racist perspective. And that's more the idea of us trying to build community. So we're looking, for example, there's a new podcast by Amnesty in Canada that's looking at anti-Black racism. There's a news organization in BC that looks at Indigenous issues. And so we're trying to do those kinds of partnerships in hopes that, of course, we will grow both audiences, but also really looking at it from a perspective of community rather than numbers. And so it's one instance where we hope that looking at it through community will help to drive the numbers versus the other way around. But it's a different philosophy, I guess, right? It's just trying to ignore the numbers at first. And of course, we do have to go back to the numbers, but really thinking about the process of creating this kind of community of journalists in Canada.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, consistent with some of my earlier comments, not putting a ton of stock in the numbers, generally speaking. When I put forward for a SSHRC grant or for, I'm fortunate enough to have Canada Research Chair that helps fund some of this. So it's been less directly tied to a specific grant. It's not really tied to a specific grant at all, other than my view that it's consistent with what I try to do. My metrics are large enough. I'd be disingenuous if I didn't suggest that I don't raise it. Of course, I mentioned the kind of numbers that it gets alongside some of the other stuff when I'm putting forward a grant, but it's candidly framed more broadly in sort of a commitment to a knowledge dissemination strategy that is grounded in being open access, in making it as broadly available as possible and as accessible to as wide a range. I know we're going to talk about accessibility in a week, but as accessible to as many different kinds of communities as possible. And I think it's become an important part of that, and generally a fun part of it, which is why I keep doing it.
I guess the other thing, I mean, just listening to you talk also, I think that I need to say that I am in such a privileged position of not having to worry about the finances. I work for a nonprofit journalism, and it's a very rare place to be in Canada right now, to not have to be worried about the numbers every moment of my life. Most of us who are in this kind of journalistic practice are really concerned about numbers and audience. And we are lucky to have to think about it in reverse, and lucky enough to say that we have the numbers that back us up now. So when I started, I didn't know, but now season 5, I know I've got the numbers to also support what we're doing. And that really helps a lot. So there's the privilege of the audience that follows us along with it. And there's the privilege of being nonprofit and being funded by SSHRC and by other organizations, and having the full 100% support of my media organization, which is the conversation behind me to do this kind of, innovative type of journalism, which it is a privileged position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I'm not coming from a journalistic organization, but kind of like Michael, I'm at an academic university where it is part of our job to do knowledge mobilization work. And not everybody needs to create a podcast, of course, but Michael and I have both decided that podcast is part of that kind of work. So yeah, I feel quite lucky that it is part of my job to do these things, and I get paid my salary as long as I continue to do my job, right? And then getting the funding for RAs to help out, that's where the granting comes in. But it's not the same as I need to produce something that is like business viable.
I mean, I do.
Yes, you do.
but I'm just saying I'm lucky enough to actually have had some space to think about it in reverse. And that's been really a wonderful privilege.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So one of the questions we've got from the audience is, when do you decide the metrics are telling you your podcasting efforts might not be worth it? Asking for a friend, they say. So I mean, all three of us have clearly decided that our metrics do suggest it's worth it, or we're willing to ignore it, even if they don't. And so here, I mean, maybe you have thoughts on that. Maybe there are other podcasts you started and decided not to go for, or we could also think about this in terms of, how do you know when you need to change something up in your approach, and do metrics kind of influence that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, well, we are changing our approach a little bit partly because of metrics, partly because we feel like there's a gap. But we started this pod partly because, as I said, it was an innovation project. It was funded for that reason, innovation in journalism, and we really saw a very wide gap in Canadian media that needed to be responded to. So, I don't know. I'm always somebody who wants to encourage people to go with a creative mission. If you feel that it needs to be built and you want to build it, build it. At what point do you stop? I'm not sure. There's all kinds of stories out there in the world where people say, I did this for 2 years and nobody came. And then in the 3rd year, all of a sudden people came. So do you stop? I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I must admit, I think the numbers will be different for everyone. When I started this, I looked at my Twitter followers and the average number of readers I might get in a day on my blog, and sort of was hoping that, okay, everybody's just going to immediately start listening to a podcast and they'll follow a specific Twitter feed related to the podcast. And it didn't happen. The numbers were pretty decent, but it still took some time. And recently I started up a Substack, which is really just replicating a lot what I have on my blog, but I do include the podcast on it as well, partially because Twitter's imploding, and so I thought this was a useful place to be as well. And I have to say that I had some people, and the numbers are still small relative to what I the kind of audiences that I might typically find on some of the other sites, but that's okay. I've seen how some of the times this grows, and I'm quite willing to kind of wait. And I've had a number of people say, I didn't know you had a podcast, and they discovered it through Substack. So it's like, oh, that's whatever works kind of thing. But just one other thing. I mean, I think there's just frankly way too much emphasis on numbers here. I look at audience quality and impact far more. And, when I started doing this a few years ago, sometimes people might know who I am, but they certainly know the podcast because it just started. And so you'd have to explain the podcast and why this would be a worthwhile use of their time. And I have to do that far less now. I mean, typically I could send someone and they're often familiar with it, or at least happy to give it a listen. So I feel like it is reaching some of the right people. And then when you get, as Vinita mentioned, when you get these messages from other professors or teachers or just anyone who says, you know what, I listened to your podcast, I thought it was really good. I've heard it from MPs and senators sometimes. That tells me that it's worthwhile, because I think it's having some impact. And so I don't think you have to have massive audiences to have impact if you've got the right kind of audience.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot that you can learn about the value, the utility, the whatever word you're going to use for your version of success that doesn't come from the numbers. And I want to go back to okay, what are the kinds of feedback then that we get that aren't numbers that's useful to each of us? But Michelle would, I think, be upset if I didn't mention benchmarking as one of the core answers to the question of how do you know when the numbers are telling you this might not be worth it. What you need to do is you need to set up your specific benchmarks. And then if you're reaching those benchmarks, you're on the right track, or you have the wrong benchmarks. Hopefully you got the right benchmarks. If you're not reaching those goals, you need to think about why you might not be, and what can you do to experiment with your approach to figure out a better way of communicating your information, reaching your audiences, sorting out, is it a formatting issue for my episodes? Is it a tech issue that I'm having? There are so many different things that could be causing your metrics to not be what you hope they are. And so paying attention to those numbers that are coming up on your dashboards, and then trying to investigate a little bit what's going on to see what you can fix. I think that's the best solution, rather than just saying, there's a clear cutoff where if you're not getting this many downloads, you shouldn't have a podcast. I don't think that's the answer at all. I think it's more an indicator of, all right, it's time to go experiment, try and figure something else out. All right, let's go back though to that question of all that kind of feedback that you get that isn't numbers, that you don't get from the metrics. What are the key things that matter to you? So Michael, you were just mentioning a few things like which people are listening to it and getting emails back, those sorts of things. Are there other things that responses you get that you take on board and really, impact you?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that I take all responses on board, quite honestly. So I don't push people to like or subscribe or whatever. But certainly when I get feedback, that alone is a pretty big indicator. Years ago when I started doing some advocacy work around different issues, I remember speaking to some MP offices and asked the question, how many letters did you need in order for something to have an impact? And their response first was that all the kind of astroturfing stuff where people are sending stuff just doesn't work. So they said the first thing we do actually is look at the postal code. And if the postal code's in our constituency, we'll pay attention. And if it's not, it goes into the blue bin, because that's not gonna make much of a difference for us at all. And they said, well, okay, but how many letters do you need? And the response was 2. It's like 2 letters from a couple of constituents is enough for us to say that if 2 people took the time to write, there are many more that are like-minded, are thinking the same things, because it's a pretty high bar to get to the point before you're going to write to an MP. And I sort of feel the same kind of way with this. So it takes a bit of a high bar before you get to the point, less for someone to retweet or like something on Twitter. That's fairly easy, and you see some of that. But for someone to take the time to write me to say, hey, that was really good, or I wish you had done that, or you're missing this, or whatever it happens to be, or you should do an episode on that. That to me, that's an elevated level of engagement. And so I really do take all of them seriously, and no question that some of that feedback has an impact on the kinds of episodes that I might run, or on different topics. Sometimes there's really good suggestions, and sometimes it's even just technical responses. It's like, man, your sound sucked this week. And it's a good reminder of just how important quality sound is with all of this. I totally did not appreciate just how important that was. So no matter what those kinds of responses, they're often very helpful that way.
When I was a young journalist in New York a long time ago, I worked at the Village Voice, and the letters, this is when people wrote letters into the newspaper. That's what I'm saying, a long time ago. It's a newspaper. People wrote letters into the newspaper, letters to the editor, and the story that you told, Michael, reminds me of this, is that the letters editor sat me down one day because I had a negative letter. And he sat me down and he said, for every negative letter that comes in, there's 100 people who are thinking the exact opposite of this. So you take every negative comment that you get, and just remember, this is times 100, because there's 100 people out there that think the opposite of this one negative letter. And so sometimes I do see those negative letters that come in, and I remember that letters editor in New York City, Ron Plotkin was his name. He really helped me out, because he really reminded me that, like you say, it's 2 times 100, or it's 2 times 200. So I really take into account the negativity. When the negative letters come in, I remember there's 100 positive ideas out there for every one negative. And also I love the letters, as I said, that come in from professors and from teachers. It really means a lot to me.
Yeah, I think for me, when I started the podcast, I started it for my students, and I was assigning it in classes. And this was in the middle of the pandemic. And people started telling me how, like, their partner was listening with them, or their parents were listening with them, or, is it okay if I forward it to a friend? I'm like, yes, please do. That's excellent. And that kind of feedback is really helpful when you get this was so good, I wanted to recommend it, and you didn't even tell me I needed to recommend it, kind of thing.
It's pretty cool. They talk, sort of the research out there about podcast hosts and the relationship that listeners develop with their hosts. It is kind of surprising. It's like the thing that you guys were both talking about when you did that episode of just you talking, and how surprised you were about how well they did. It's partly about that you develop a relationship. We develop relationships with our audience, I think, that we're not also necessarily aware of. And we can become aware of it through these kinds of anecdotal stories. People have told me, I downloaded that one episode 3 times. And I am like a little bit worried. Is it because you didn't understand it? I'm like, no, because it was so complex. I wanted to listen to it 3 times. I wanted to get every sort of bit of that person talking. And, I don't talk too much in my episodes. I really try and give the space to the scholar. But that it means a lot to me that they're downloading that a few times so they can really take it all in. So I like to hear those kinds of stories.
Absolutely. And from kind of a pedagogical perspective, that's one of the things that I explain to folks when I'm talking about why I bother creating this podcast. It's because this format is one where people can download it multiple times. They can listen to it over and over again. They can slow it down. They can speed it up. I create these transcripts, and so they can choose to read. And that sort of ability to connect with a wider range of people in a wider range of kind of ways, I think is really, really helpful.
I mean, as a journalist, when I see somebody else taking up the same story, or when I see someone else using the same guest that we had for the same topic, that means a lot too, because it means people are paying attention. They're coming to our podcast to understand the issue from a critical race perspective, and then taking that and sort of disseminating it in their own way, whether it's CBC or CTV or global. I've seen it, and I'm happy. I'm happy that they're doing that.
Yeah, and that to me reminds me a little bit of what, Michael, you had said earlier on too, of using the podcast to elevate voices that might not always get the attention. They might not be the ones that get called on regularly. And then once they get featured in this kind of really engaging conversation, that can help boost their visibility within really important communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that you're sometimes taken by surprise at just kind of the reach that this has, even long times afterward. And sometimes people don't necessarily remember everything that they heard. The same is true when you appear on the news. They remember they saw you as opposed to remembering anything you said. But these podcasts, very often they kind of make their way into little niche areas and has a real impact, certainly on people's understanding, but oftentimes for an individual who's expert in their area, may have worked really hard, and oftentimes may have struggled or may not have thought as much about how do you take some of that work and some of those important views and put it more broadly into the public sphere. And there are some academics who are really good at it, and there are some that don't think as much about that. Their focus is on producing the research in the first place, and speaking to their more direct community. But I think there's great value for a great many researchers and academics to try to provide that broader context and to have that kind of influence. And oftentimes, some of the best ways to do that is going to be through someone else's platform, especially if it's a platform that gives them the space to be able to speak on their own terms, as opposed to in the 5-second or 10-second soundbite that you might get in a news clip, and they didn't really get the point at all. This kind of more long form discussion provides a really, I think, really excellent opportunity to kind of expand and allow people in their own voice to talk about what some of their issues are. And so, just as a note, we haven't talked as much about production related issues, but in my case, I provide a rough advanced script. So people have a sense of where it is I want to go. It's a conversation. I'm listening. It's not something I stick to 100%. I want to make sure that it's a real conversation. But I also want to make sure that I can bring people on that may not have the same view as me, and try to put them at ease that this is not a game of gotcha, and I'm not trying to bring them on to trick them up or make them sound bad. And so whatever I can do to put their mind at ease. And I should note that certainly when you bring on public office holders, especially, I've had some privacy commissioners on, as I mentioned, some ministers and MPs and others. They tend to be even more, I think, concerned about some of those kinds of issues. So you've got to try to provide some real assurances in that regard that this will be a positive for everybody.
Thank you. All right, we are starting to run out of time. There's a few more questions from the chat I want to get to, though. So we're going to hop over to a question about promotional efforts. So do metrics influence your approaches at promoting? Does your promotion and marketing approach impact the way you then develop your podcast episodes? What's the relationship, if any, between these different kinds of analytics that we've talked about and how you get the podcast out to the people you want to listen to it?
Yeah. I mean, I can jump in if you like and start by saying, just again, because I'm not paying a ton of attention to the analytics. I don't think that has a whole lot of influence, but I do have at this stage a rough formula of what I do. I don't know if it's the best one or not, but it is what it is. Where I do have a Twitter account specifically for the podcast. I think 700 or 800 followers on that. So I'll start there and then move to later on to my own and to the Substack. And obviously it appears in any number of different places. And then I'll usually promote over at least 2 to 3 days over the course of that week. So there'll be several on Monday and there'll be several that will follow. And there's a little bit of A/B testing almost to see kind of what works and what generates at least social media interest with some of the stuff. I also create a short sort of video clip as a teaser for each episode, so that people can listen to up to, on Twitter, I think it's up to 2 minutes and 20 seconds, but usually it's around a minute that I'll do coming from the person, so they get a sense of some of the stuff that's there and they can listen, and hopefully that draws them in a little bit as well. And we'll post to YouTube and basically whatever I can do to try to expand people's awareness of the episode, which is kind of challenge one.
Yeah, it sounds like you kind of mesh together a variety of different strategies across different platforms, which is great. And it is a way definitely of reaching wider audiences. You mentioned, you get on Substack and then somebody finds you because they're there. It's also time consuming though, and there's limited resources that we all have. And so for me, one of the things that has been challenging is figuring out which promotional approaches are worth the effort and worth my time. So, I also have a Twitter account. I never put a ton of effort into making it a big thing. And now Twitter is, as we know, kind of imploding. And so I have a lot of questions myself about what are the best ways to promote and market a podcast.
We've done a bunch of experiments. It's kind of like, because we just don't know how else to do it, right? We track the number. Well, our podcast episode is like, okay, it's at 4,000 downloads now. Let's do a Twitter campaign. Let's send out an audiogram and see what happens. Does the number go up? Does the number go down? We can't, it's really hard for us to tell, there's no track back to tell where that click came from. Did it come from Twitter? Did it come from Instagram? We just have no idea. I'm super lucky because I've got the Conversation, as they say, backing me up, and they've got a very large Twitter account, a very large, we're a global organization, so we have a very large Instagram account. So I use those to help build the audience. So I had some very built-in methods of promoting, but we do the audiograms, we do the tweets, we do all those kinds of things, but as you say, very time consuming. We always do a post with show notes on the Conversation site as well. We've done Instagram lives, which took up a lot of time and are fun, but I don't know, did they do anything? I'm not sure. So we've tried different methods. I just don't know. I don't have an answer there. I can just say we keep throwing things against the wall to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely for Wonks and War Rooms too. We've experimented here and there. And I think one of the things for me is because I am not trying to get to the point where a bunch of people want to pay me to advertise their things on my podcast. I feel less fire, I suppose, to figure out like what are the top marketing strategies. And instead, my goal is how do I get the people who I think most need this information? How do I get on their radar? And that's very different from developing a marketing strategy, I would say.
Yeah, I've sat in on marketing workshops for podcasts, and I think a lot of the folks who are like the experts on this, I've sat in on their workshops, and I think for them it's also a lot of guesswork that there's no track back, so you don't know. But you just have to keep trying these different methods. I've been told that audiograms are moving this way, and now there's going to be another style of promoting. So we just. Is it the video podcast? I hope not. Those are the kinds of things that I'm hearing. So
yeah, the thing that I'm seeing very often is, the Patreon podcast combo where the audio is released for free to everyone and then the video one is paid for. And adding video it makes the editing process so difficult.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. We have a few questions we didn't have a chance to answer. I'm really sorry to those of you who we didn't get to your question, but hopefully you found this interesting nonetheless. We are going to wrap up now, and I just have a few thank yous to offer. So first, I want to say thank you to the Office of the Vice President Research at the University of Ottawa, who offered a knowledge mobilization grant to the Center for Law, Technology and Society at U Ottawa. And that is how we were able to host this workshop and next week's workshop. It's through a SSHRC Exchange Grant. I also want to thank Vinita and Michael for being guests here today. This was a really interesting conversation. I think that We brought up a lot, and there's a lot more we could talk about. Luckily, we do have another workshop next week, same time, same place. You do have to register separately though, so go register for the second one. I believe somebody should be putting the registration link in the chat here for you. And next week, what we're going to be talking about is accessibility in podcasting. And so there we'll talk about things like how to do the kind of pre-production, how to set up your podcast and then your recording in a way that lends itself to creating accessible content, and then to how you share it out with the world, and those annotated transcripts that I mentioned earlier. We're going to go through all of that and more. So please join us. Thank you so much, Michael and Vinita. Thank you so much, Michelle Hennessy and Michelle Bartleman, the two research assistants who have been on the call today, coordinating all of the Q&A and getting the slide deck together. I'd also like to give a shout out to Riley Alp, who couldn't be here on the call today, but has been really integral to Wonks and War Rooms and to creating these workshops. And then the last thing that I wanted to do here is say, if you've got any feedback, if you have questions for next week's episode or anything like that, you can reach us at polcomtech.ca. You can reach me at elizabeth.dubois@uottawa.ca, and you can find all of the hosts here on various places on the internet. Googling our names will solve the problem, but we're also going to be sending you an email later this week with links to the 3 podcasts we talked about today, links to the various places you can find us on the internet, and a handout that summarizes most of the information we went over in today's conversation. So thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.